Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with pistachio stuffed pork. That's right, I took something I usually use as a crust on top of meat and turned it into a stuffing to put inside meat. And the results were just as delicious as they were gorgeous. Plus, you're also going to learn how to make another one of our famous 3-ingredient pan sauces so you can finish this dish off in style. But first things first, and we'll start by trimming our pork. And what we have here is one pork tenderloin that has kind of a tough membrane near the top, which we call silver skin. And if we take a thin, sharp knife and slide it underneath that and cut to the end and then slice back like this, we can remove that without losing too much meat. And that cut was fine for a home kitchen. Okay, in a restaurant we would have got yelled at, since if you're careful and take your time, you shouldn't have any meat attached to that membrane. But anyway, the point is we'll remove as much of that as we have the patience for. And by the way, we're only removing that obvious membrane. There is a thin layer of regular white fat in certain spots, which we do not need to trim off. And then once trimmed, we'll take our knife and slice right down the center. But, and this is incredibly critical, we're only going about 75% of the way through. Okay, the only way to mess up this technique would be to cut all the way to the cutting board and have the two pieces of meat separate. Okay, if you do that, forget this recipe and just make some pork cutlets. But if we are able to cut about 75 to 80% of the way through, and we have, as we call it in the business, butterflied the tenderloin, we will transfer that onto a piece of plastic wrap. And then we'll place another piece over the top, since the next step is to pound this out fairly thin, or something a little bit thicker than 1/8 of an inch, which I believe might be like 3/16. And this is going to be pretty easy if you have one of these meat pounders. But really, any heavy flat object will work. But no matter what you use, once it's done, it should look something like this. And if it does, what we'll do is wrap that back up and pop it in the fridge while we move on to make our stuffing, which starts by chopping up some whole roasted and salted pistachios. And exactly how fine you chop these is going to be up to you. Right, I like them fairly fine, but I do like a little bit of diversity when it comes to the size. So I'm actually going to stop right here, which is going to give me a nice mixture of tiny pieces and medium pieces, as well as an assortment of pieces that are basically halves. And once our pistachios are set, we'll take some Dijon mustard, and we'll add a whole bunch of minced garlic, plus a little touch of maple syrup for a little bit of sweetness. Although if you prefer, you can use honey. I mean, you are after all the Justin Trudeau of your pork stuffed with pistachio. And that's it. We'll season this up with a little bit of freshly ground black pepper, a touch of salt, plus a few shakes of cayenne to play it safe. And then we'll take a spoon and give this a quick mix. Oh, and in case you're wondering, this mustard pistachio combo is something I use as a crust on rack of lamb. And it works so well, I always wanted to try it as a stuffing. Speaking of which, once that's mixed up, we can pull out our pork, since our next steps are to stuff, roll, and tie our meat up. But before we do, let me show you a very cool trick, where we trim a little bit off the pointy end, and we place it over the other end, where those two pieces of meat have separated a little bit, although it's probably better if we turn the flat side out. But anyway, if we cover that part with meat, and then place our plastic on top, and give this another brief pounding, those two pieces of meat will adhere to each other, and once cooked, you will never know that even happened. And by doing that, we get a more uniform shape, which is going to make everything easier to roll up and roast. And then what we'll do once that's been accomplished is take our mustard mixture and spread it evenly over the meat, pretty much going all the way to the edges, except I think we do want to leave a couple inches of unmustarded meat on the edge furthest from us, since that is the direction we're going to roll our pork, and we don't need a whole bunch of the filling squeezing out. And that's it. Once that's been applied, we'll sprinkle over a couple tablespoons of breadcrumbs. And I'm using panko because that's what I had, but regular crumbs will work. And then we will follow that by applying our chopped pistachios, covering the surface as evenly and thoughtfully as possible. And once those have been applied, we can give them a very light pressing down with our fingertips before we proceed to very carefully roll this up. And we will definitely use the plastic to help this effort. And by the way, it might seem like I'm going kind of slow and being a little too careful, but I'm not, since we want to roll this up nice and tightly. But if we press and squeeze too hard as we roll, we're going to have stuff coming out the ends and along the seam. So please take your time and pay attention to how much pressure you're applying. And if we do have anything that falls out the ends, we'll push it back in. And once we finish and get rid of the plastic, we'll make sure our seam's at the bottom, since that is the position we want it in when we tie it up. And then what we'll do is take 7 or 8 lengths of kitchen twine, and we'll slide the first one under about an inch or so from the end, and we'll twist that through about 3 or 4 times, and then we'll pull it nice and tight, but not so tight that it starts cutting into the meat. And that's it. We'll finish the knot, and then trim off the excess. And while there are cooler looking, more complicated ways to do that, for me this is the simplest and easiest way. And since we're going to trim it off before we serve it anyway, who cares about some fancy looking trussing? And that's it. Once our tenderloin is tied, I like to apply a little bit of salt and pepper to the outside. Right, the inside was seasoned, but the outside was not. And yes, you can do these steps ahead of time, a couple hours. So once we're done, we can transfer this into the fridge until we're ready to roast. But you know what? I'm ready to roast. And the first step for that is to sear this on all sides over medium-high heat and a little bit of vegetable oil. And you can, if you want, just skip this step and pop it in the oven to roast it. But as I've tried to teach you, browned meat is more flavorful meat. So to me, this is definitely worth the extra 4 or 5 minutes. Plus, above and beyond flavor, I think it also looks better. And that's it. Once browned, we will turn off the heat, and we will transfer that into the center of a 425-degree oven. And we'll cook that about 16 to 20 minutes, or to an internal temp of 140, at which point it's probably going to look like this. And once we pull that out, of course we will leave the towel on the handle so nobody gets burned. And we will quickly and safely transfer that meat onto a plate, and we will tent it loosely with foil, and we'll let it rest for at least 10 minutes. During which time, I think we should make a very simple pan sauce, which is done by pouring in some seasoned rice vinegar, plus some chicken broth, and we will bring that up to a boil on high heat. And while this reduces, we will scrape off any goodness that's on the bottom of the pan, as well as on the sides of the pan. And I know it looks burnt, and it kind of is, but that's fine. We can always strain this before we pour it over the meat. And not only are those charred bits going to give our sauce a beautiful color, they're going to add a little hint of bitterness, which as usual is going to elevate all the other flavors. And once those liquids have reduced to about this point, and it seems like things are thickening up a little bit, which will be even more noticeable if you use a homemade stock because of the gelatin in it. But anyway, when it gets to this point, we'll turn off the heat, and we'll toss in a chunk of cold butter, and we'll keep that butter moving either by stirring or by shaking the pan or by both until it disappears. And if everything goes according to plan, a few moments later, you'll be looking at a beautifully glossy, slightly thick, perfectly emulsified pan sauce. And that's it. Besides maybe tossing in a pinch of salt, our sauce is now ready to strain over our sliced meat, which since it's rested for 10 minutes, we're able to do. And as I was slicing this, it smelled so good and it looked so amazing. I could not wait to eat. And I will plate this up properly in a moment. But for now, I'm going to have to settle for a couple scrap pieces, plus that first piece I sliced off the end, which is going to be the most dry, most overcooked part. But even that was moist and delicious, which is how I knew the rest was going to be amazing. So I went ahead and plated up 3 nice slices, alongside some roasted potatoes, and then I spooned plenty of that strained pan sauce over the top, before finishing up with a few freshly snipped chives. And that's it. What I'm calling pistachio stuffed pork was ready to enjoy. And what I really love about these rolled stuffed pork tenderloins is that they look so visually impressive, which makes people think it took a lot of skill and expertise to do. And the final product always looks way, way harder than it really is, which of course will be our secret. It is totally fine to let people think we're way better than we are. Okay, I've built a whole career on that. And as far as the flavor and texture go, if you do cook this to an internal temp of 140, you're going to be enjoying something that's very moist and tender. And if you've never had the combination of pistachio with a Dijon mustard, I think it works incredibly well. And I predict it's a flavor combination you will use again. And as much as I enjoy it as a crust on a rack of lamb, I might even like it better as a stuffing for pork. Which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, Enjoy.